Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Virtually 2024, Nomensa's free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference. For our final virtually session of today, we have Beverley Newing, accessibility lead at the UK's Ministry of Justice. Beverley was once a quiet, introverted front-end developer when one day they decided to pipe up in an all-hands call and suggest they should have an accessibility team. Fast forward a few years, and Beverley now leads an accessibility team of 6 in one of the largest government departments. In this talk, Bev will share a few of the leadership lessons they learned along the way and some things that they're still working on. We are joined, of course, again by My Clear Text, who are providing live captions, and you can access these by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of Zoom, or alternatively, I will drop a stream text link in the chat for a fully adjustable page of captions. As always, please do get involved in the discussion in the chat. Do let us know where you're watching from. Just make sure your settings are switched to everyone and not panelists and hosts. Please submit your questions for Bev using the Q&A box. I'll try and get through as many as I can at the end. And yeah, finally, this session will be recorded and we'll be sending out the videos of all this week's talks as soon as they're ready shortly after the event. So yeah, I will hand over to you, Bev.
Oh, thank you, Henry, and huge thank you for inviting me along to this conference. Big fan of it, and yeah, it's been a great day, hasn't it? So my talk is titled "So You Pitch for Accessibility and Now You're Leading on It." So a bit about me, as Henry touched on, I'm the accessibility lead at the UK Ministry of Justice. My name is Beverley Newing, and my pronouns are they, them. My Twitter handle, or the app formerly known as Twitter, is WebDevBev. And on this screen, there is a meme of a seal. The seal is angled away from the camera. You see mostly its face. It's sort of squishing its neck, squishing its face into its neck a little bit. It's looking at the camera quite awkwardly. This is sort of how I felt when I approached leadership for the first time. And I like memes, I like animals, so I picked this as a theme, and there'll be lots of seals throughout this talk. Before I go into the talk details, a bit more about me. In my spare time, I'm head of development at 3 Rings CIC. Although we're quite fluid on titles, really. I do a bit on the dev team, I do a bit in the comms and engagement space. And 3 Rings is the volunteer management system behind things like the Samaritans, Childline, Nightline, lots of things, and we're all volunteers as well. So that's really fun. I'm the creator of Record a Goose Sighting, which you may or may not have heard of. It is a fake government service that is full of accessibility issues, and you can use it as a workshop exercise. You can do it on your own, so kind of testing your accessibility testing knowledge. And lastly, I'm a motorbiker, a themes person, and a forager. So those hobbies, they're all quite introverted. On a motorbike, you spend a lot of time on your own, obviously around the vehicles, but you're sort of not talking to anybody. I do a lot of sewing, again, a pretty solitary hobby, and foraging is also a pretty solitary hobby. And they're all quite technical and quite crafty hobbies. So yeah, I'm pretty introverted. I'm not very outgoing. I like being on my own. So yeah, I say that being somebody who's doing a talk at the moment, but I do talks and I do lead a team. And one of the points I want to make with this conference talk is that, you know, being introverted, being technical, you don't have to be a particular personality type to succeed at it. So I'm of the opinion that anybody can be a lead. It's just about identifying what the gaps are in your knowledge. So what is it that you might need to upskill on? What is it that you need to be able to do in this role? Breaking it down into pieces so that it becomes achievable and you can focus on the skills rather than, oh, I'm not extroverted, therefore I'm not going to be any good at it. It's achievable. It's just thinking about how you're going to get to that point. So as the intro touched on, I'm going to be talking about this from my point of view. I used to be a front-end developer, and I now lead a team of 6. I had a background in events and management, so I worked for Code First Girls for a little bit in an internship, running their courses and working with their sponsors and with doing events. And I also ran a chapter of CodeBell for 2 years, which again is a lot of workshops and inviting people who are developers to work with people from underrepresented groups in tech to come together and teach each other to code. But primarily in my paid career, I'd been a developer. And as I mentioned, I've now got a team of 6. So the photo on the screen is actually a little bit out of date, but these are some of the people that have been in my team in the past. So going from left to right, we have U Young, who is one of our accessibility specialists. She's currently on loan to GDS, but she is returning in September. Very much looking forward to having her back. We've got Risha, who was our intern in the delivery management space. We have Martin Glancy, another accessibility specialist. Andy, another accessibility specialist. Myself, Charlie, an engagement manager. Catherine, another accessibility specialist. And Emma, a delivery manager. So quite a big team, and also a variety of different job roles as well. So not all specialists, kind of multidisciplinary team. It's a really rewarding job. I really love it. It's a great job, but it is quite different to what it is that I used to do. And burnout could be a whole talk in itself. I won't talk about it very much, but it is quite common in this industry. So my hope is that in this talk, I can share some tips and things I worked on that helped me prevent getting particularly burnt out. The other thing that I want to touch on is that accessibility lead means different things in different places. So some places you might be more focused on documents like PDFs, Word, etc. Other places you might be more focused on code as well. In another place you might want to be running a champions network. In a different place you might not be running one because it's not big enough to warrant one. Craig Abbott has got an amazing article about the variety of skills in the accessibility space, and it's called Don't Attract Unicorns with Acorns, which I highly recommend if you've not read it. It's a really great read. But my point here is that different places will need different things. So a big part of your role as somebody pitching for it, or as somebody currently leading on it, is figuring out what is important in the department or business or organisation that I am currently in. So a question to the audience, feel free to put your answers in the chat. Are you an accessibility lead? If not, would you like to be one? I'm interested in this from the perspective of it's a good way for people to meet each other. So for example, if you put in that you want to be one, you're aspiring to be one, there might be other people who put the same thing in the chat. Or if you're already one, maybe you want to talk to other people who are doing the same sort of thing. It's a way to meet each other, get connected, form connections, because as I'll touch on later on, that's quite important, I think. Okay, so whilst you're doing that, I'm going to run through what the agenda is very roughly. I'm going to break this down into 4 main stages. The first stage is figuring out the bigger picture. I'll spend about 5-10 minutes on that section. The next bit is finding your own feet. So I'll spend about 10 minutes talking through that. The next section will be leading others, about 10 minutes on that. I'll round up the talk with my Northern Stars, so the guiding principles that I try and keep in mind every day. And then there'll be about 10 minutes for audience questions. Alrighty. So the first bit I'm going to be talking about is figuring out the bigger picture. This was what I found the toughest of all the stages. And on the screen now we have a photo of a lot of seals. I'm going to hazard a guess that there's about 50 seals in this photo. There's some baby seals, there's some older seals. They're all facing different directions. They've all got different facial expressions. Some are just looking in one direction, some are looking at the sky. Some seem to be yelling at each other. They're all doing different things, and it's quite a big, there's a lot going on in this picture. And for me, this is sort of how I felt when I transitioned from being a developer to this role, because as a front-end developer, what I'd normally do would be focused on one project. So I'd be working on one website for maybe 5-10 days, or if it was a bigger project, a bit longer. And then I'd move on to a different thing, or maybe at maximum I'd be in a team where there'd be a portfolio of things, but you would still work on one thing at a time. With accessibility, it's a little bit different really, because well, at least in my team, we operate as consultants. So we've gone from being focused in one area to we're looking at the whole department. So OPG, Office of the Public Guardian, could be what we do one day, The next day we could be looking at the legal aid agency. So no 2 days are the same. It's one of the things I've grown to really love about the role, but it is a little bit different. Despite this though, at the start you might still get pulled into technical tasks. So, you know, you've maybe got a reputation of being a developer, or people might be used to kind of coming to you and saying, oh, can you just look at my thing? It will take 5 minutes. It rarely takes 5 minutes. It often takes a bit longer than 5 minutes. And it's quite tough to shift and make that kind of gear change from being available to lots of people to trying to be more strategic about it. So one thing that I did quite early on that I really recommend is, it was a bit hard at the start, but I created a form. And for anybody who reached out to me on Slack and said, can you look at my website? It'll take 5 minutes. I would say, yeah, I'm very happy to look at your website. To help me to help you, can you fill out the form? It would take 5 minutes. And then from that, I would get loads of data from the team on where it is they're based, the URLs of the service, any deadlines they might have. And it basically offloaded some of the admin about gathering the information from my plate to them. That helped me out quite a lot. And also created a little bit of a buffer as well. So I had a bit of time to not necessarily be as reactive to things and have things come into the inbox. And as my team grew, be able to delegate as well and give that work to the other accessibility people in my team. So on this screen, we have 4 balls with text in, and underneath these balls there are seals. It's an image of a seal's head, and it's trying to recreate that kind of classic image of a seal balancing a ball on its nose, but there's lots of seals. It's one of the more tenuous things to seals in this deck. So we won't spend too much time on that. But your job may now include lots of different things that wouldn't have been in your role previously, such as contract management. That was a big new one for me. Or wide accessibility strategy. Again, a bit of a new one for me. Line management and also comms and engagement. So there's quite a few new skills that might come into this role. A good starting point is proving why you're needed. So you're kind of facing this landscape. There's a lot of things going on. The job role has changed a little bit. A really good starting point is get the data. So get that form set up, get people to fill it out, use that to then look at what are the patterns and themes. So maybe in the last month, you had about 10 people asking about documents. And when you drill into that data, it turns out they all were a bit stuck on flowcharts, for example. And from this data, you can start to figure out, okay, what's the big picture? What is needed in this organization? And that will then help you figure out how you approach your strategy. A really important thing is breaking that down into chunks. So maybe in that scenario, you've looked at the data, you've identified that people want help with flowcharts and they want a course. But create accessibility, create a flowchart course is actually quite a big thing. So looking at that and then breaking it down into manageable chunks is really important. So for example, task 1 could be review the data. What are they actually asking for? Maybe we've already started that by identifying its flowcharts. They want training. And the next step would be to identify maybe some stakeholders that you can involve throughout the course content creation, creating the content, doing a run through as a pilot, and then working with the comms and engagement team to spread awareness about the event that's happening. There's quite a lot that goes into like those tasks. So making the time to break it down into chunks, and that will then help you roadmap what you're going to do on them. I've touched on it there a little bit with engagement. It's really important to figure out who you need to engage with and how. So if you're successful in pitching for accessibility, it probably means that somebody somewhere gave you funding. And if they gave you money, then they're probably going to want to know what you did with it or are doing with it. So that person will be the first obvious stakeholder. But it's worth also having to think about who else you want to get on board. So for example, are there any heads of digital or service owners who are in key positions that you want to encourage to think more about accessibility? So at the Ministry of Justice, we operate a steering group where we get the heads of digital and the director of digital in a room once a month. We have about 25 minutes. We have a really snappy agenda. We run through key stats, we bring problems to them that we're encountering, and they help unblock us. So that might be something that you want to consider doing. Also, by thinking about, are there any networks or communities of practice or diversity and inclusion teams that you'd like to be engaged with? So once you've got your list of people that you think would be useful to work with, it's then also worth thinking about, how do you want to work with them? So for example, do you want them to be able to influence or affect your roadmap? Or do you want them to be more informed? So are they people you want to engage with in terms of giving them a say over the steer of your work? Or are there more people that you want to know what's happening about what you're doing? So a comms team, for example, that you might want to keep them in the loop about any events that you're doing so they can help promote it. Yeah. It's particularly important to engage lots of different people because the age-old quote, accessibility is the team sport, and everybody needs to be on board. At the end of the day, we're all influencers really, aren't we, in accessibility? Not really how I ever thought I'd be describing myself, but realistically, we aren't the ones who are making the code changes, or at least in my team, we don't make the code changes. We aren't the ones who go onto GitHub, we do the pull requests, we don't do that. What we do though is we meet with teams and we review things with them, or we suggest changes, or we, we'll have long conversations about how to approach a problem, but we're not the ones actually making the changes. So we very much need to be part of that kind of team, and it being a team sport where everybody's doing their bit and we're one part of a bigger team that needs to be in place to make sure the changes actually get over the line. We are probably the weirdest seal image of the deck here. This is I don't think it's AI, I think it's from that phase a couple of years ago, people were creating these images in Photoshop, where in this particular image, it's a horse or a pony's legs and body, and then there's a seal head on top instead of a horse's head. And it's a bit of a weird image, but it was the closest I could get that incorporated the idea of a seal into the idea of a PR pony. And the text on the slide says, I use a PR pony. So about 1 year into this role, I was having a conversation with somebody that I'd recently met, and they quite casually just mentioned and said in the conversation, oh, I use a PR pony. And it took me a good minute to be like, hang on a minute, what do you mean by that? And they responded with, I use a person that they wheel out to say, look, we've got a pony, look, we care about this topic. And then they put you back in the stable after they've kind of done that PR piece. And that really stuck with me, that kind of concept of, are you there as a token, or are you there as a, a legitimate part of the organisation that is respected and engaged with properly. I don't think I've ever been the PR pony. I think at every point we've been respected and engaged with. But it is the question that every so often I do sit with myself and think, okay, is that what's happening right now? And if it feels like it's leaning in that direction, what can I do to shift and change it? And that's why things like the steering group come in really handy. Creating a culture of shared responsibility, making sure it's a team sport, it's really, really important. We have a culture at MOJ of that. My team is not responsible for accessibility, we all are, and we own the collective risk. And if you end up being in a position where you feel like you're the only person who is responsible for it, you really risk burnout, and that's not a good place to be in. Been there a little bit myself, it's not a good time. And also it's not really particularly helpful as well, because if you end up being the person taking everything on, if you then do get sick for whatever reason and you take a substantial chunk of time out, who is then carrying the torch for it in your absence? So the more people you get involved, the more people own the responsibility of it, the better it is for accessibility and the organisation. So we're now going to move on to the next section. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of things, activities, ideas that are useful to consider when approaching thinking about accessibility in your organisation. I'm now going to talk a bit more about finding your own feet. So on this slide, we have a photo of a seal. It looks a bit cold in the background. There's a cold sea in the background. It's on some pebbles. But most importantly, the seal has got its eyes shut. It's got its feet, seal hands wrapped around it, kind of pulling itself together, and its skin's a bit wrinkled, and it looks a little bit unhappy and like it's been through something. That's it. And that is a little bit how I felt when I really kind of got to grips with the things I just talked about and was like, oh, this is a really big job. A couple of years ago, I went to a conference and I saw this graphic that was created by somebody called Tara Ojo. And in the middle, you've got a light yellow circle with the word comfort in it. Around that circle, you've then got a darker orange kind of around it that's got the word stretch in it. And then around that, you've got a bigger circle which has got the word panic in it. And this is a kind of comfort versus stretch versus panic zone. Again, it's another mental image that I try and check in with myself on every so often. Am I in the stretch zone, which is, the growth zone where you're learning and developing? It's a little bit challenging, but it's, out of your depths. Or are you in the panic zone where actually you're probably not learning very much because you're probably quite stressed and there's probably too much going on. Yeah, and that's very much where I was, the red panic zone at the start, really. Because some of that stuff that I talked about just now, it might not be in your current skill set. It wasn't in my skill set at the start, being really honest about it. And it was a bit of a learning journey. There was a lot to get to grips with. I always used to being a developer where I was told build a component for a website, and I wouldn't even talk to the stakeholders because I'd be quite removed from that. That's what the product managers would do. And going from that to this type of role was quite a jump. And on top of that as well, if you're now an accessibility lead, you are essentially your own boss. You're probably not actually your own boss unless you're the CEO of the company. But you are now the person who is the lead. You are the person who is at the top of the chain for accessibility in your organization. And you are the accessibility lead. So that was a bit of a shift as well. Things that help with this, the DDAP framework, I think it's now been rebranded to the GDD framework, which is the government digital and data. But a couple of years ago, myself and the other heads of accessibility and government came together and we wrote out a list of the skills required for each level of accessibility specialist roles. So it covers junior, mid, senior and head of accessibility. And it lists out the skills that you would expect to see at that kind of job level to give you a bit of something to kind of work towards and a bit of a target as well. One thing that I do quite a lot is I create learning plans to identify something that I'm not really very confident in. Maybe it's a new skill, maybe stakeholder engagement could be an example of that. I will identify what it is I'm not really sure about, and then I'll research materials that I need to read to kind of skill up in that. And I'll talk to people that I know are also skilled in that as well. But making a learning plan, breaking it into manageable chunks, little like checklists on a Trello card is really helpful. I touched on it just there. I think something that's really important is finding your mentors, plural. So I've had a couple of really great mentors over the years. David Caldwell, who was the head of accessibility at the Home Office. He was and still is my mentor. We've been working together for a good couple of years now. I've also got another mentor who is a senior civil servant in the Ministry of Justice. We meet in person once every couple of months. With both mentors, we talk about different things because they have different skill sets. And so, maybe I'll go to David about how do I approach this bit of this strategy? And I'll go to my other mentor about how do I approach comms with this particular group of civil servants, because in my department, we work with digital, but we also expand beyond that and work with people outside of digital. So that's a little bit complicated because you have different cultures in those two business areas. So that's a little bit tricky to navigate. And when I identified that, I found a mentor and she's been helping me with that. And I encourage you as well to go back in the chat and again connect with other people who are in similar places or maybe are working on things that you aspire to be working on, and start to build those connections, because it's really, really helpful. And most people are actually really happy to be asked to be a mentor. It's quite nice, isn't it? There's somebody respects you enough to want to learn from you. So yeah, really recommend that. The next concept is finding the hacks that help you. So on this slide, we've got a photo of a seal. Yeah, fairly standard seal. It's a headshot looking at the screen. I've put on some clip art glasses on its face, and I've put a little briefcase next to it. So some of the hacks that I found that help me feel a bit more comfortable in the work that I do. If I know that I'm going into a particularly senior stakeholder group or from a different part of the organisation, I will have a think about what the culture is in that part of the organisation, and I'll often dress up. For example, I'll wear a blazer or I'll wear a shirt because I know that's sort of maybe the etiquette in that part of the business. And also it gives me another layer of presenting confidently to that group. Conversely, sometimes if I'm feeling particularly nervous, I might take my glasses off, which is a bit of a controversial one. But my sight is about -5, so without these I can't actually see very much. But sometimes it helps just to kind of take away the kind of visual stimulus of what's going around me, to kind of then refocus on what is it that I am thinking about and what's my own kind of vision and ideas on this particular point. I'll often just pretend to be cleaning my glasses as I do that, but it's the little things like that. So what helps make this more comfortable for you? What works for you? On this slide, we've got an image of a seal. It's doing that classic seal thing of being on a little stand next to a pool of water. So it's kind of obviously learned to kind of get up there and be on its perch. It's got a trainer next to it, and the text is be open to new techniques. There might be lots of new things that you are unfamiliar with, and with that comes the opportunity to learn about doing things in a different way. For example, your mentors might have some ideas on how about you approach this in this different way, or how about you go about it in a different way. It's approaching it from the perspective of how can I grow and how can I develop whilst being in the stretch zone and not in the panic zone, and taking it as an opportunity to learn new things and grow in new ways. Imposter syndrome is real, and I think it's worth keeping track of how you feel in relation to this as well. At points, mine can get pretty bad. So I've got a Trello board where I keep note of everything that I've done I'm proud of, or even the things that I'm not necessarily even proud of, but that I know I achieved and did. And when I'm feeling particularly like, oh, today was a rough day, I'll look at that board and be like, oh, okay, no, wait, I did a talk on that topic and I delivered that dashboard, or I created that thing and it landed really well. And keeping a log of the things that you did that will buoy you up on those days when you're feeling a bit not as great, because you'll get days like that. I think with every, it's normal, isn't it, to have ups and downs, and getting those things in place that will support you when you're having a bit of a rougher day is important. Related to that, support and champion yourself. On this slide, we've got a photo of a baby seal, I think, with some it's not clip art, it's photoshopped pizza that it's holding in its hands. I've been doing a thing since I started my career where if I do something that I found really challenging, I will make a note of buying myself some pizza afterwards, or some different type, like a donut or some sushi or something, to try and reward myself for doing the thing that I didn't want to do, that I knew was a good thing to do. I took that concept from Lara Hogan. She's got this website where every time she does a similar thing, she buys a donut, she takes a photo of it and puts it on a website, and she's got this gallery of donuts and achievements linked to it. I do sometimes wonder if it's a bit like Pavlov's dog, sort of training yourself to to do the things you don't want to do because you know you're going to get a donut at the end of it. But I think it's actually worked pretty well. we're going to get a pizza later on today after this talk. And the last point in this section is quoting the glorious RuPaul from RuPaul's Drag Race. If you can't love yourself, how are you going to love anybody else? It's really important that you're kind to yourself and that you factor in, what is it that I need? Where am I at? How am I doing? Because otherwise it's quite hard to interact with other people positively. So on that note, moving on to the next section, which is leading others. On this slide, we've got a photo of two seals. One is just minding its own business, just I don't know, it's just sat there, not really doing anything of note. The one next to it is sort of recoiling, its sort of eyes are bulging a little bit, you can see the whites of its eyes, it's got its mouth open. Can't quite tell if it's going to bite the seal or run off in the other direction. I think it can be difficult leading other people. Obviously, never bitten anybody. It's not what I'm getting at with the slide. It's more the kind of, oh, I'm not used to leading other people. How do I approach this? Like, what is my role in this new dynamic? And so I've got a section on that in this talk. One key principle that I always try and bear in mind is making sure that my bad day doesn't become somebody else's. So following on from what I said in the previous section, yeah, if you're not feeling great, if maybe you've had a series of back-to-back meetings where they were quite challenging, maybe things didn't quite go the way you wanted to, maybe you've got something else going on outside of work, just making sure that you're also looking after yourself, and if you need space in your day, making sure you put focus time in. If you need to take time off, and having things in place so that if you do need to take time out, you know who's going to be the delegate lead in your absence. Question for the audience, one for the chat. Who here has had a difficult accessibility interaction? I know I have over the years. I will say not very many, but I have had a few where I can still remember them, and it is quite a challenging space to work in. I will say there is I think that intersection of, we aren't necessarily the ones making the changes to the code, we're in that influencer role, but we also understand the importance of the work and what has to be done and the impact of it not being done. So we do sit in a difficult position, I think, as specialists. And made then even more complicated by that, we sometimes have to call people's babies ugly. There's a photo on the screen of a seal, a parent seal with a baby seal, and it's got its arm protectively over the baby seal. It's tough. It's tough. You know, there might be a product team who've been working long days on a project. The stakeholder has been really, you know, breathing down their neck for the past 2 months on it. And then when you have somebody come in at the last minute and say, oh, this has got 20 WCAG fails and 10 usability fails, and, you know, this shouldn't be going live, that is not going to land great. That's difficult. It's a difficult spot to be in, to be the person being told their baby is ugly and also being the person having to tell somebody else their baby is ugly. So ideally, you know, teams will come to you much earlier on in the process, but, you know, it does happen that sometimes it's at the end and you just end up in that situation and you're in it at that point. As well as telling people their babies are ugly, we're also helping people through the valley of despair a little bit. There's a photo here of a seal with a valley in the background. It's looking a little bit lost. And for those of you not familiar with it, the valley of despair comes from the concept of consciousness and competency. There's a graph of it. So at the very start of the journey, you might be unconscious of that you are incompetent. Blissful ignorance, where you don't know what you don't know. But then when somebody tells you, actually, you've got accessibility issues in your service, you then become conscious of that you've been incompetent. And I mean that in a non-judgmental way. I just mean it in the literal sense of the word. It's not a competency that you have, but you're made aware of that, especially in a professional environment as well, where you're being paid to kind of deliver work. So that is uncomfortable. Our goal is to help people from that valley of despair, the conscious incompetence into conscious competency, so where they're making the effort to make the changes and be competent, and ideally even through that stage to unconscious competency, where people don't even need to talk about it or think about it very much, they're just doing it. But it is tough, and it does mean that sometimes you end up in some interactions that are, you know, ideally they would have been a bit different. For those scenarios, boundaries are very much your friend. So we now have a service level agreement that we send off to teams when we know we're going to be doing lots of work together. We agree up front, what are the expectations, what are the boundaries, who do you think I am, who do we think you are, how much time do you have, what sort of activities do you want to run, what sort of activities do we think you need to run, what's the middle ground. And we agree up front, we have agreements so that if we ever need to kind of revisit, if it's working, we can go back to what we agreed up front and then discuss, okay, are we adhering to this? Have we kind of swayed off? Does it still work for us? If not, maybe we call it a day. But that's really helped us, having those sorts of agreements in place. I mentioned earlier finding mentors and finding mentors. It's also really important to find your friends and peers. So when I was a developer, there were lots of developers. There's loads of us at Ministry of Justice, and it's quite easy to find somebody to just have a chat to, really, about the technical specialism that you have and just be friends with, really. Whereas with an accessibility lead role, because you've got that lead title, there's now a little bit more of a kind of hierarchy that you're in. And it does change things a little bit. And I think this is probably one of the things I found the hardest going from a developer to this role, was trying to figure out, oh, who do I chat to about my day now? Who are my friends? You know, how's this going to work in terms of that kind of social connection with people around me? And probably made it a little bit harder with the pandemic as well, because that's sort of, for me, this career switch happened over the pandemic. So looking at the people in your nearby area, for example, who's got the same sort of not job title, but similar sort of role as you. So for me, the design system lead is one of my new work besties. He works in a similar sort of capacity, you know, cross-cutting across the department. Also in the kind of technical code space. So we have that kind of in common. I do accessibility, he does the design system, but we're still able to have, you know, good conversations and catch up about our weekends, and I really value that friendship, and it's been quite important to me. So I'm now going to share a couple of ideas that I keep in mind when going into meetings. The first thing is a question that I always ask myself when I'm in a meeting now. It's, why are you in the meeting? So for example, somebody puts a meeting in your calendar and they don't tell you why it is in advance, I will often decline them, and I'll go back and say, great to hear you're thinking about accessibility. What do you see my involvement in this as being? You know, what are you kind of looking to get from me, so I can let you know whether or not I can give that to you? Because that's important, making sure that you're the right person, and also that it's a good use of your time as well, because especially at the lead level, you're going to have a lot of different things going on that you're going to need to be working on. And I will say that is probably one of the biggest things I'm still working on, is saying no to meetings that kind of come in and focusing on the things I need to get done. But I do regularly try and ask myself this question: why am I here? Am I the right person? Are we going to reach the outcome that we need with moving in the room? And then lastly, one of my favourite ones that I got from a management book is called Whose Back is the Monkey On? So the concept of this is, you're in a meeting, you're talking to somebody about their website, maybe it's built by a supplier, and maybe in the course of this meeting we identify that in the contract with the supplier it mentions for code 2.1 but not 2.2. So at that point a task is created of, we'll need to ask the supplier to update the contract to 2.2. So at that point you can visualize the task as a monkey. And the monkey wants to get on somebody's back because, you know, somebody's got to do the task. So I try and visualize the task as the monkey. And if I'm leaving the monkey, is it appropriate for the monkey to be on my back, or should it be on their back? So in this fictional scenario of this team needs to update their contract with their supplier, I would say that sits with them because they're the ones who've entered into the contract. They know their commercial contracts, etc. So the monkey should be on their back, really, when we leave the room. And so I always try and visualize that and make sure to be explicit in the meeting around, okay, cool. So we have an action. The action is to talk to the supplier. Are you happy to do that action? And then leaving it with them, and also getting it in writing afterwards as well, so you can refer back to it in the future. So that concludes that part of the talk. I'm now going to go through a couple of my Northern Stars very briefly, and then I'm going to open it up to some questions from the audience. But the first of my Northern Stars, and on the screen now we have a photo of a happy looking little seal. It's on a sandy beach. It's sort of arching its back and it's looking up at the sky. So it's daylight, so it's probably not going to be stars in the sky in this picture. But the gist is, it's a seal that's stargazing. The first one is, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I learnt this one the hard way. Early on, I approached it as a sprint, and then I burnt out after 6 months and had to take a break from accessibility for a little while. It was just a bit too much when you're trying to get everything done really quickly. There's always going to be more work to do. There's always going to be more services. Services are going to be retired. Services are going to be created. They're going to be spun up. There's going to be new documents that get created. There's just going to be a lot of new. It's never ending, really, and that's not a bad thing, as long as you're aware of that and you kind of pace yourself appropriately. So if you try and approach it as, I'm going to eat the elephant in one go, I'm going to do it all in one go, and try and do everything in parallel, you're going to get really tired out and it's going to lead to burnout. So approaching it as a marathon, okay, taking your time, looking at the wider landscape, being strategic about the wins that you pick is really important. Similar note, be pragmatic, pick your battles. For example, MOJ is a big place. We see a lot of teams on a regular basis. Maybe, sometimes you might end up in a scenario where you've got the choice of working with 2 different teams. And maybe one team they're being quite hostile. I will say it doesn't happen very often, if at all. But maybe in this fictional scenario, we've got one team who are being really resistant. They don't really want to do the work. They'll join meetings, but reluctantly, or they'll push them back weeks. And on the other hand, you've got a team who also has reached out to you. They're interested in accessibility, but they're being really proactive. They're organising meetings with you. They're actually responding to the feedback that you're giving them. They're making the changes. I think it's better to go with people who want to do the work, because if you end up fighting people who don't want to do it, you can go down the route of escalating it. And there are some occasions where you will need to do that because it's a really important service. But being pragmatic in which battles you choose to pick, because it is energy and it's a marathon. There's a lot to do. Picking the right thing to do and being pragmatic about it is really key. And lastly, finding your technical serotonin sources. So as I mentioned, I was a front-end developer. I was a very technical person. And so these days I do a lot of sewing, which is still quite a technical thing. You have to choose the fabric. You have to figure out what the size you're going to make it in, cutting out the patterns, learning new kind of stitching techniques on the machine. For me, it gives me that kind of technical serotonin hit, which I still need and don't get as much from my day job anymore. My very last one before I open up to questions is be kind. Being kind is really important. As I touched on, this is a tough job. We're working with teams who are under pressure. And I think kindness is just key to this line of work. And on this slide, we have a photo of 2 seals, which are sort of looking at the camera, looking really cute, and they're being quite cozy with each other, and it's a cute picture. So that is pretty much it from me. Thank you for listening. I've got a question for the audience, which is, which bit resonated or interested you the most? or also, do you have any tips yourself that you want to share? But yeah, opening up to questions from the audience.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bev. What an amazing talk. I absolutely love what you said about everyone and accessibility, essentially being an influencer. I like to think we might see an influx of accessibility conferences at beach clubs in Dubai now. No, I love all these lessons in leadership, and yeah, so much transferable advice for any role and life in general there. So yeah, thank you. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, if you could drop them in the chat or via the Q&A function. And yeah, I can get through as many as I can. Bev, you've obviously been on a huge kind of learning journey when it comes to kind of leadership and accessibility. Is there anything you'd have done differently in retrospect?
Yeah, so the marathon versus sprint one, I started off doing this as a 6 months, so not so common, it's a comment, I guess, from being a developer, and I tried to do everything. I got very frustrated that we couldn't make very much progress as a team of one in an organization of 90k staff. I wonder why that didn't work. But I took it personally, I think, in hindsight, and I thought it was my own failure that I couldn't get further than I did. And then I took a bit of time away from it, and I now look back and think, well, that was the start of a marathon. It wasn't a 100-meter sprint. It was the start of a long journey. And yeah, I wish I could go back in time and chill out a little bit and be a bit kinder to myself at that point in time, because that was pretty rough.
Amazing, thank you, Bev. So we've got quite a few questions dropping in now. So first of all, we have a question from Regine, who is asking about if you've got any tips for anyone working in quite a siloed organization. Any tips on how accessibility can be a shared responsibility?
Yeah, that is a tough one. So I touched on that. We run a steering group at the Ministry of Justice. So we sit in a function called Central Digital, which is sort of a cross-cutting. There's a bucket of people who work cross-cutting across digital. And in the Ministry of Justice, we have 5 business areas: Legal Aid Agency, Office of the Public Guardian, Criminal Injuries and Compensation Authority, HQ, and HMPPS, Prisons and Probation. So they all have their own kind of purpose and function, but they all have digital as cross-cutting across them. So they all have their own head of digital. So we make a point of meeting with the heads of digital in those spaces and escalating to them any risks or issues. And then we have the consultancy form, which is open to anybody in the organisation, so anybody can fill it out. And then we report on that upwards to the head of digital in the steering group to say, this month we had X amount of requests from LEA, and this month we had X amount of requests from HMPPS. And we can kind of track spikes in demand, engagement, and look at, okay, maybe we need to do some promotion in this area. Head of digital in this area, can you help us out with that? So that combination of metrics and having those kind of levers to pull that senior steering. No, lost it. A steering group to leverage.
Awesome, thank you. So next question we have that's been submitted anonymously is asking, how can I get stakeholders to see accessibility as a priority when it has historically not been? Thanks for the great presentation they had as well.
Thank you. That's a tough one. I mean, in government, we have the lever of the risk. We have the public sector bodies, accessibility regulations. We have the team at GDS who actively monitor it. And they do monitor it, they do reach out to teams as well. So, we do hear from them in the department. So that is really helpful for us in central government. So it's worth thinking about what's important to your business. So maybe if you're in central government, that's the lever you can pull. If you're in maybe the private sector, thinking about arguments like the Purple Pound, and thinking about as well the impact on your service of people not being able to access it. And maybe thinking through who are the user groups using your service. We sometimes apply that a little bit internally. So for example, Office of the Public Guardian, that applies to people who are maybe at a point in their life where they're losing capacity in some form or shape. And so there's quite a high proportion of access needs in that particular business area for them to consider. So we'll encourage them to think about it from that perspective. Prisons and probation, that's got its own kind of different discrete user groups as well. So it's thinking about what's in, and as well it's that kind of axis of, it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to the digital team on the ground, they're probably going to be really invested in the user and the impact of that on the person, that impact of accessibility in the service on the users. If you're talking to somebody in senior leadership, their day-to-day work is very different. They'll be talking to portfolio, they'll be talking to spend, budgeting. It's a different lens and a different day-to-day reality. So for them, that risk lever is probably more immediate to them in terms of their day-to-day as well. So it's really thinking through what is important to this particular person that I'm talking to, and then leveraging that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So the next question we have from Monica, who asks, how did you pivot from front-end developer to accessibility lead? Was it a position that opened within your organization, or did you position yourself to create that role?
Yeah, good question. So I positioned myself, well, we created it basically. So I touched on that I did a 6-month long secondment into accessibility. In that time frame, we did things like creating a survey, which we then rolled out to the entire digital function, that created metrics around how competent people thought they were, how confident they felt about accessibility, how many of them had written accessibility statements. So trying to kind of baseline the accessibility maturity of the organisation, and the consultancy stats as well. I did roll off accessibility after that 6 months, then went back to being a front-end developer, but I was allowed to continue doing a little bit of accessibility work. So continuing those things, like running that survey every year, continuing to run a consultancy with the metrics coming in. That meant that when it came around to December, which is like just before the spend reviews that happen in the kind of February through to April period, we had the stats to then be able to pull together a deck that said, this is what we're seeing in the data, this is what we think will fix that, we need a team, can we pitch for it? And yeah, that combined with going into the all hands meeting and yeah, asking a question of the chief financial officer of what his plan was around accessibility, given he was disability champion. Those two things in conjunction helped with that. It's thinking about how can I get the stats to then be ready to ask at a particular point in time, and also how can I convey that information in a way that means they'll have access, it's accessible to the person I'm giving it to. And by that I mean a bit later on down the line, a few years later, we pitched for the team to grow from 4 to 7. It was at the point of asking, it was a no, but we gave that information to them in the form of a slide deck, which they then kept to hand. They could understand it and read it without us being present. And so a couple of months down the line, they'd obviously revisited it and thought, oh, hang on a minute, we do not have budget. And then, yeah, I was told, okay, yeah, actually, you know what, fill out the forms tomorrow and we'll get some contractors in. So having that deck sent over so they had it in the future when they would have funding was, yeah, it was a bit of a like, oh, okay, so there's a bit of a gear change. It was a bit unexpected, but it worked.
Awesome, thanks, Bev. So we got time for just a couple more questions. So we have a question here that's been submitted anonymously, asking, what advice would you give someone who wants to get into accessibility as a career, especially if it's not something they've done before?
Oh, very good question. I think the pragmatism point is important. I think one of the things that I really loved when I started doing this was getting to see so many different things. As a developer, you normally kind of see one service or one particular area, and with this you see loads of different things, and it's really interesting and really focusing on that pragmatism really of you know, it's going to feel really stressful if you go into it thinking you need to solve everything straight away. And I sometimes see that with people, you know, that I've worked with over the years. There's this kind of frustration at not being able to move the bar as fast as they want. But, you know, making time to appreciate the wins that you can make and logging them, and yeah, trying to not get bogged down by it.
Brilliant, thanks, Bev. So we've got one more question here from Flo. Flo asks, I'm in a local authority, so we're not big enough to have an accessibility team. I'm based in ICT, and accessibility is loosely in my role. Where would you suggest accessibility sits in the organisation? No one particularly seems to want to take ownership.
Oh, also a very good question. That's a tough one. I'd be happy to chat with you, Flo, as well, on LinkedIn about that, because it depends a little bit on your org structure. It can sit in different places, really. I mean, so my team sits in central digital, which is a cross-cutting function in digital, because we're quite a big department. I think just as digital is around 2K staff. It's a lot of people. Depends on your org, and it depends a little bit on what the output of your org is as well. Because I've seen some places where you have the accessibility team in the comms and engagement team, because a lot of what the organisation does is comms and documents. So I've seen quite a lot of that. I mean, we're in digital, which is, you know, ICT really. I've seen accessibility sit in assistive technology teams as well. That's another place it can live. It does depend a little bit on your org structure, but yeah, really happy to chat a bit more about that.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Bev. And yeah, thank you to everyone that joined us. Yeah, that's all for virtually day one. Tomorrow we're going to be back with talks from Nomensa's Ronnie Hendricks, Elaine Kay, and Natalie Patrice Tucker. There is still time to sign up. Just head on over to our Eventbrite page if you haven't signed up for either tomorrow or Thursday's sessions. Again, Beverley, thank you so much. That was such a great talk. We will be showing the recording as soon as we can. And yeah, we hope to see you all back here tomorrow. Thank you very much.